Hi, Susie. Welcome. Welcome to the Diversity Talks. It is lovely to see you again.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you, Aya.
In our conversation, in our time today, I would like to ask you 4 or 5 questions. But
Yep.
let me first introduce you. Suzie Lewis, you are the executive transformation coach, but you're a team coach as well. And you are the
Yep.
founder and managing director of Transform for Value. So
Yep.
you help organization transform organizational culture. And one of the services you offer is design for inclusion. So you
Yep.
simply help them design and create inclusion in their organization. I'm very much interested in that. So we will come back to that. But
Okay.
my first question to you is, what is your definition of diversity? And what is the relationship with power and power structures?
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for the introduction. I'm thrilled to be here. Design for inclusion. Inclusion for me has always been a big topic. But I like your question of what is my definition of diversity. My definition of diversity is difference and respect and acceptance of that difference and using it as a positive lever for change. So it can be visible diversity. It can also be invisible diversity. And I think there is a lot more diversity in society and in the areas where we work than we actually see, literally see, or than we think. I love your question around power. It's a big question. I think particularly today, when the distribution of power has changed massively with the onset of social media and networks and communities that sort of create themselves. And I think the distribution of power is changing. But I want to come back to the definition of power in organizational structures, because you do have a lot of power dynamics. You have informal and formal power dynamics. And I think their relation to diversity is often about how people in the system live those power structures. So how do they experience those informal and formal dynamics? And often that's very different depending on who they are, where they come from, and whether they're in more underrepresented groups in that society or not. So I think that's my definition of diversity. That's the link to the power structures. I think it's a lot more intricate than that when you get into it. But for me, it's about understanding 2 things: what your difference is and what your power structure is. So how does that dynamic work around you, and where do you sit within that power dynamic? And only then can you think about how you're going to navigate those power dynamics.
Susie, could you please tell us, you work with organizations. What kind of power dynamics do you observe when you work with them?
So I think it's very interesting. They're coded into an organization, and they're also coded into humans, of course. So I'm talking about hierarchy. So hierarchy is a great example because you can see it on an organization chart. It's an actual structure, but it's also an internal structure for humans in terms of who has power over who. So, team leaders have power, if you like, over their team, although it's up to them how they interpret that. So you can see it in managerial practices. You can see it in cultural practices of the way things are done around here. So, which group you belong to, which level of the organization you sit at, which school you went to, which nationality you are. There are lots of different definitions of who you are in that system, and therefore where you sit in those power dynamics. So in the organizational structure, in the ways of working in the organization, and in the codes of the culture, which are often for me linked to privilege. So that there is privilege that comes to sit with the informal and formal power dynamics, which creates that web of cultural assumptions that you sit in an organization.
And most of the time, these are the unwritten unwritten codes.
I think completely unwritten, so but very present. And I think that's the paradox. And it's, it is the diversity of that structure, is that what you see is not always what you get. So if I come back to what I was saying about power dynamics, you have to understand, firstly, what those power dynamics are. Secondly, where you fit into that and where you want to fit into that. Because for me, we've spoken about diversity, but inclusion is around being able to bring your whole self to work, so authentically. So that means that I'm sitting on my value base. So I will look at that power structure and think, okay, I am okay with this, I'm not okay with this. So it's up to me to navigate the power structures and the structures of privilege that we know exist, and you can see how it plays out in organizations. Um, and I think part of that discussion around inclusion is how do diverse profiles navigate these systems without feeling that they have to switch codes all the time, i.e., behave and speak in a way that isn't them.
Mhm. Mhm. And I would like to ask you the impact of COVID-19, because I'm curious to know what has been the impact of COVID-19 on diversity and inclusion. What do you observe?
So I observe lots of things, and I think it's not over yet, but I think two things are very clear. And I was reading the LinkedIn 2021 trends for work the other day, and one, old ways of working will die. So you can't just translate the structure that existed into a virtual environment, which is what everybody tried to do at the beginning, and that's natural. And I also think that technology is allowing more and more collaboration and networking. So I think there are two schools of thought, and I see two major things happening in COVID. One is advantageous in terms of inclusion, and one is less advantageous from my point of view. So you have a leveling of the playing field for me with the fact that everybody can now work flexibly. So what used to be to pose a problem in organizations, particularly for women, was these long working hours and the fact that you had to be present, you had to be there, you had to be in the right room at the right time, and often that right time was later on in the evening or very early in the morning. So that has leveled out the playing field, I think. I think it's also taken away a certain amount of unconscious bias because now everybody is on a screen. So you can see my background, I can see your background. So there's a certain leveling of that playing field. And it allows us to diversify our networks. So from an inclusion perspective, it means that the networks you have are not as homogenous as they used to be because this technology allows you to connect more quickly anywhere in the world. So I think that has been a leveler for inclusion in terms of allowing people equal opportunities to work together, but also to contribute and to have flexibility in their working life. I think on the other hand, particularly for gender parity, COVID has made it difficult for women, and we have lost some of the momentum that we gained in gender parity because women have taken on not only working from home, but also the family life and the whole cognitive and emotional load of managing everything at home and having to work at the same time. Mm-hmm. So, whereas before you could go to work and actually put your mind to that, now they're juggling constantly. And I think cognitively that's very difficult. So often it falls to the woman to take on the carer role and the family role. And so in a home environment, that's even more difficult to prioritize. So if you just shift those models from working from home, then the woman can quite easily go back into not having enough time to work or having to do it all. So I think there's both. And I think the advantage is it can be more inclusive, and the disadvantage is not only gender parity, but also virtual working can be very transactional if you let it. Mm. So you have to be explicit about inclusion with your teams on a screen, because you could very easily just say, what do we need to deliver? Who's delivered what? Thank you very much, bye. You don't have to check in. You don't have the social coffee machine part. So I think as a leader, you have to be very, very careful about how inclusive you are and be explicit about it. Otherwise, you could be exclusive without wanting to.
Mm-hmm. But do you believe that, in the long run, COVID-19 may have a kind of positive impact on, diversity?
Yes, I do. But I think we have to make that effort explicit as well. Mm-hmm. So when I think about COVID and what happened and all the 2 or 3 advantages I named at the beginning, they can only remain advantages if organizations, I feel like saying, learn that lesson. So if we actually take on the learning from what happened in COVID, So this stereotype we had around flexible working, where managers didn't necessarily trust their people if they weren't there and present, and women didn't necessarily have the time to do this because they had to have a family as well. Those type of stereotypes have been leveled out somewhat. And I think we need to keep that effort going in terms of having that dialogue and making sure that those opportunities are left open and actually explicitly formalizing them.
Mhm.
I also think that from a diverse point of view, in terms of networks and global working, yes, it's a big advantage from COVID. And the other big advantage from COVID is rethinking the way we work. This is the biggest imposed learn by doing experiment that the world has been through. I think, we hit crisis and the brain goes into fight or flight and it's, oh, we need to do this, we need to do this. Taking that step back as an individual, as a leader, but also as an organization, and looking at the ways of working, and let's come back to designing for inclusion,
Mhm.
intentionally thinking about it. How could we craft our employee experience differently?
Mhm.
How could we use this opportunity? Because from every crisis, there is an opportunity.
Yes,
But
right.
it's easy to say that, of course, when you have that distance. But so, yes, I do think COVID has brought a lot of opportunities for a more inclusive environment and to bring the richness that diversity brings to any organization or community and to use it more explicitly. Um, I'm a natural optimist, but I think COVID has also made people realize that we are wired for connection and human connection. And inclusion for me is all about respect and human connection. So, yes, I do think there are lots of opportunities there, but they need to be explicitly framed, formed, and dealt with. Yeah.
I very much agree with you. I believe that, as you said, as you perfectly said, I see crisis as our chances to change stuff that we are not
Yep.
happy with. So I
Mm.
believe that COVID-19 has created certain level of awareness everywhere, not only in
Yeah.
organizations, in the world, across the world.
Mm.
But the question is, what needs to be done to keep this, make it sustainable. That's the question.
Yes. And this is why the discussion around the new normal,
Yeah.
it's about balance, and I hear a lot of people saying, oh, well, when things go back to normal, I don't think things will ever go back to normal as it was before, but I think that's a good thing. And I think that's evolution. And I think we should take that on and make something positive out of it for future ways of working. I don't think we'll have that much choice because, like I say, I think the workplace has changed forever. And I think that's a good thing. I think it's an evolution.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. Susie, when I have guests from different sectors, from different organizations, I try to ask them, what kind of progress has been done, about diversity and inclusion. I believe that in order to measure any progress, we need to first understand, how do we measure diversity and inclusion? So I would like to ask you, when you work with organizations, how do you measure diversity and inclusion in an organization?
Thank you for that question. It's one of the most important questions for various reasons, partly because I think it brings us back to aligning on the definition of the difference between diversity and inclusion. So, if I answer your question, how do you measure diversity? There are lots of metrics, particularly HR metrics that measure percentages of women, percentages of generational representation, percentages of nationalities, percentages of underrepresented groups across the organization. They also measure absenteeism,
Mhm.
which for me is also, and they measure is a measure of well-being, which is also around how you feel in your culture, which brings me to inclusion. So the KPIs that are on a standard dashboard today often measure diversity quantitatively. So we have this
Mhm.
percent of women, we have this percent of women in this process. Let's take recruitment or performance management or talent. And I think that's necessary, but it's not enough. And then you have the sort of inclusion measurements, which start with things like employee surveys, pulse surveys, well-being, and unfortunately burnout and absenteeism. So how are our population doing? How are the employees feeling? That's also a start of a discussion for me around how inclusive is the environment. For example, we don't measure presenteeism today, or not many places measure presenteeism. I think they should. because I think you lose a lot more in terms of employee motivation and money through presenteeism than through absenteeism. Now, to come back to a COVID discussion, that's clearly going to be less of a discussion now because presenteeism is going to look very different, but it's still a very interesting subject. So there are three discussions I have with organizations. It's what do you want to measure for diversity and for inclusion? Why are you measuring it? What is it measuring? Quantitatively, but also qualitatively. What is the outcome that we're looking for? And, you know, moving to measures of inclusion, I think, should be more around, and it can be simple visual management techniques. I'm a big lean management fan in terms of visual boards, which is why I like Agile, you know, Kanban, smileys, project boards, but you can have boards on how inclusive people feel that processes are. You can have boards on check-ins, how are people feeling today? You can have boards with collective objectives. So, you know, most performance management systems today are run individually on an annual, yearly basis, and you have one discussion with your boss. I mean, I'm being very, very black and white, you know, if that's the standard. But I think you can quite easily create collective responsibility and a collective vision by saying, these are our collective objectives. Every week for 20 minutes, we're going to stand around that table or around the screen now and have a look at where we are because it's our responsibility. So you're creating that psychologically safe space and you're asking people how they feel week in, week out. That's a very good measure of how inclusive your environment is. You can also measure how designed your system is for inclusion or not. What do the processes look like? Do they reward the behaviors we're asking for? Is it in line with the values? So all those sort of softer measurements that are qualitative and that come from interacting with the employees and asking them how they think and feel about their environment are critical to understanding whether inclusion is working in inverted commas or not in your environment, because the only people that can tell you that are the people who live there. So how do they experience their environment?
Could you please, this is my last question to you. You, as at the beginning, I explained that you know, you help organization create, design and create inclusion in their organization.
Yeah.
Could you please tell us how can a diverse, inclusive organization be, inclusive company culture be designed?
So that's a huge question. I'm going to try and answer it simply. I think, you know, culture is to humans what water is to fish. Okay, so it's where you live. And I like the definition of it's how you think, act, and interact, because I think there's a personal level, how you think and feel, psychological safety, belonging, are you respected? How you act with your peers, with your team, with your suppliers, and then how you interact. So what do those organizational systems look like? So what are the processes like? What's the governance like? What are the policies? Are they inclusive? How do they play out in that organization? And we always start from, and that's why I use the design thinking methodology a lot, because it's simple, but also because it allows these 3 steps to define the what is. So aligning on what the landscape looks like, how inclusive is it, how do people experience it, really getting into that empathy part with how people are experiencing their environment. And then you move into that ideation, sort of more creative part about what could be. How could we do things better, and where would we do them better, and how could we pilot it to see if we're right? Because I think this whole cycle of iteration, you know, learning from what works and what doesn't work is really important, because you're creating a space where people can actually express themselves. And then you come to what I call what works for us, so defining our model. And I think the biggest part of creating inclusive cultures is aligning on the definition, having as much diversity around the table as possible to understand how it's lived today and how it could look, and then what works for us. So there isn't a one size fits all, and inclusion is incredibly personal in the way it's sort of experienced and felt. But that doesn't mean that there aren't blocks to an inclusive environment, like empathy or psychological safety or co-responsibility. You know, let's stop the blame game that goes on in these power structures and organizations. And it can be as simple as a manager checking in with his team every morning, every week, or it can be as huge as let's look at the top level processes for performance and reward recognition and make sure that it's more collective than it is today. So there is a whole landscape of things to be looked at, but you need to start small and you need to get people involved. And I would say my big thing is, when you do that, go and find people who are as different as possible from you, because that's what you need around the table.
That's great.
Because otherwise you're just working in homogenous networks, and that isn't going to bring the perspectives you need to make it more inclusive.
That's great. Oh, I love that one. Suzie, thank you so much. Our time is up.
It's a pleasure. I can't believe it's already over. Thank you.
Thank you for being with me today. Thank you for your great input. Yeah, I think anyone who is going to watch us will benefit from what you shared with us. Thank you.
It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you, Aya.